The pandemic profoundly impacted us all. The restrictions and loss of personal freedoms left many isolated without access to loved ones. This film shares an extract from the book Narratives of COVID, Loss, Dying, Death, and Grief During COVID-19, capturing 3 individual narratives from the authors themselves.
TTFN by Laura Patterson. Dr. Graham Edward Hobson was and is my dad. Funny and clever, with a BSc, MSc, PhD and DSc. He described himself as a real doctor and invested a lifetime in the genetic engineering of fruit. But his ability to alter genomes couldn't stave off Parkinson's or prevent his 2 subsequent heart attacks. A fortnight after celebrating Dad's 90th birthday, his low blood pressure meant a hospital admission. My head hurt as I considered his loneliness. A few days post-admission, a doctor rang to say Dad had agreed to a do not resuscitate order. I sat with this information, angry at the thought, coupled with an awareness of the COVID crisis and the need for a sensible approach. A second call came. We're very sorry to tell you that the man in the next bed has COVID, and we've been nursing them both without PPE. My heart shattered into a million pieces. I wanted to scream at COVID and at God, but in the end, all that lay before me were 14 interminable days of waiting and praying. After 10 days, with promises that I'd find carers for him at home and would nurse him myself, despite living 120 miles away, they agreed to transport him home. His wit, fierce determination and resilience had gone, replaced by a frail old man, incoherent, incontinent and immobile. And whilst the changing of soiled pads and flannel bed baths felt like a pitiful reflection of our relationship, these were the very last acts of love I could bestow on him. There were some brighter times. Once we dressed him to sit for his soup at a table, and he reminisced coherently about old friends. That day I took one final photo of him smiling. Another time he asked about my PhD, and I was able to reassure him that I too would be a proper doctor one day. I would leave the house only to weep uncontrollably, because even in my denial, I knew the end was coming. Gradually he stopped eating and would only accept teaspoonfuls of water. The interminable wait for death to arrive made me wonder if leaving would help him take that final breath. I packed, and after a wrenching goodbye, I left. Minutes after, the carers rang to say Dad had slipped away. With a searing loss in my heart, I arrived home, and everything and nothing had changed. 1 week later, we came together for the last goodbye. Everyone gathered in disparate, solitary groups near the church. No hellos or hugs, just waves of sad acknowledgement. The sight of the coffin broke me. My brother hesitated. The social distancing rules were clear, but he put compassion before risk and held me as I wept on his shoulder. 10 months have passed, and the pain explodes in waves. Having no parents is like being lost at sea, abandoned and alone. My dad's death won't feature in any COVID statistics, though it played a substantial part in his demise. With an inability to grieve as we would want, and no chance to fully celebrate the life lost, the ache and tragedy remain.
It Could Not Have Happened at a Worse Time by Jackie Price. It is February 2020. My brother-in-law calls me unexpectedly. I was right to feel anxious. My sister Jill has had a brain hemorrhage and is being transferred to the neurocentre in Liverpool. Although conscious, the scans show a critical hemorrhage that needs surgical intervention. I phoned Dad to share this distressing news. A widower of 10 years, this is a difficult call. I drive to see Jill early the next morning, knowing that by the time I arrive, she'll be post-surgery and in intensive care. I pray everything will be successful, but I'm an emergency nurse and I know the odds are stacked against her. Being a nurse makes being on the other side a strange and surreal experience. You know some things, but not everything. My family look to me to fill in the blanks, but I only have more blanks. My sister has 2 children. They're young adults, and my heart breaks watching them struggle with the situation over the following days and weeks, and it only gets worse. I return each week, and by March there is talk of a transfer to the neuro rehab ward, where they hope she may improve from the low awareness state that she's now in. Then COVID strikes. Visiting is reduced to 1 person per week, given to her husband, but with some empathy for her children to also visit. Then lockdown brings an end to all visits. We're all lost in a world of sadness and fear. Jill is transferred to a long-term rehab centre in Chester. No visiting or way of communicating with her. What must she think is happening? When we last visited, she knew who we were. Jill was still in there. She may know nothing of COVID. She must feel abandoned, cared for by strangers whilst we live our busy lives. The sadness and powerlessness is overwhelming. We send text messages to each other as it's too painful to hear the wobble in the words, so hugs and love are expressed through crosses and emojis. Then the call. Jill may have COVID. We all hold our breath. This could be it, and we cannot even be with her. Relief. It's not COVID, and she's back to the rehab centre. This happens 3 times. It never gets easier. The news improves and visiting restarts, but we're outside, 6 feet apart, gowned, gloved and masked. No touching, not even a hand squeeze. Jill now struggles with facial recognition. I'm fairly sure she doesn't know who I am or what is happening. Dad is still in Wales. Different lockdowns mean we cannot coordinate a joint visit. He is so sad and lonely. Tears are shed after each video call with him. I visit Jill in December, this time behind a clear screen. There are smiles, but the distance is immense. I'm holding back my tears and frustration. As a nurse, I have to get physically close to my patients, but I cannot even hold my sister's hand. Her physical protection is absolutely paramount. But what about her emotional protection? The staff tell me not to worry. How do I explain that it's not worry, it is a need to show love and to connect with Jill when she's not able to speak. She's unable to tell us how frightened she is, unable to ask, when will things be better? I don't know the answers, but I do know that the decision to protect physical health above emotional well-being has had an incomprehensible impact on so many lives. Our future will attest to the emotional trauma that these decisions have wrought.
On the 27th of March 2020, my aunt died in hospital, having contracted coronavirus there around a week earlier. My uncle had been able to make 1 visit the day before she died, but was, to his lasting sorrow, unable to be with her for her final moments. The end for my aunt was seemingly mercifully swift. Within a week of being diagnosed with COVID-19, she and her husband were told that her death was imminent, and within little more than 24 hours of that, she had died. After the initial sadness on hearing the news of her death, and subsequently reminiscing with family members about my childhood, in which my aunt had been very present, I sought to understand her death in the context of what was at the time a new national and global situation, and one unlike any that I'd experienced before. These were the early days in the pandemic, as we adjusted to the strangeness of the first lockdown and attempted to process emerging information about the nature of the virus and its effects. Looking at a Facebook post I made shortly after, I can't help but notice the death toll that's recorded. 4 deaths in one part of the UK didn't sound that many even then. but I couldn't have imagined how small that number would end up seeming in relation to the overall number of deaths that would eventually occur. As time wore on, and I became aware that conspiracy theorists were claiming that the impact of the virus was being overstated, their rhetoric brought my aunt's death back to the forefront of my mind. The casual dismissal of deaths, such as my aunt's, as those that would have happened anyway, rode roughshod over the experiences of so many families, while the emotional strain on those who died will never be known. The bringing forward of these deaths by days, weeks, or months was not some mere inconvenience, but the robbing of precious final moments of intimacy and dignity. The rawness of grief has faded, but there are still things that are hard to grasp. Just as an end to COVID-19 feels difficult to imagine, so too does finding a way of commemorating its indelible effects.
Get more from the Open University. Check out the links on screen now.